Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most brutal, complicated, and ultimately disastrous chapters of the Napoleonic Wars. The invasion of Spain in 1808. This was unjust another campaign for Napoleon. It was a conflict that would bleed his empire dry, a quagmire he himself would later call his Spanish ulcer. So, how did the master of Europe get himself into such a mess? Let's find out. Our story begins not in Spain, but with Napoleon's grand obsession, Great Britain. By 1807, Napoleon had conquered or allied with most of continental Europe. Yet, across the English Channel, Britain remained defiant, its powerful navy a constant thorn in his side. Since he couldn't invade them directly, Napoleon decided to strangle them economically with something called the Continental System. This was basically a massive, Europe-wide embargo designed to block all British goods from reaching the continent. The goal: to cripple Britain's economy and force them to the negotiating table. There was just one problem: Portugal. This small nation on the edge of Iberia was Britain's oldest ally and refused to play ball. For Napoleon, this was unacceptable. He couldn't have a gaping hole in his economic blockade. So, in late 1807, he made a deal with Spain's chief minister, Manuel, a man widely seen as the real power behind the aging Spanish king, Charles IV. The deal, known as the Treaty of Fontainebleau, was simple. French troops would be allowed to march through Spain to invade and conquer Portugal. In return, Spain and France would carve up Portugal between them, with Godoy even getting his own little principality. It seemed like a win-win for Godoy. What could possibly go wrong? Well, pretty much everything. Under the command of General Junot, French troops marched through Spain and took Lisbon with surprising ease by the end of 1807. The Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil just in time. But here's where things get interesting. The French troops didn't just pass through Spain, they stayed. And more kept coming. By early 1808, over 100,000 of Napoleon's allied soldiers were garrisoned in key Spanish cities and fortresses, effectively occupying the country without firing a shot. The Spanish people started to get a little nervous. These weren't just allies passing through. This looked a lot like a stealth invasion. The political situation in Spain was already a mess. King Charles IV was a weak ruler, dominated by his wife and her favorite Godoy. The heir to the throne, Prince Ferdinand, hated Godoy and was plotting against him, seeing him as a corrupt usurper. The Spanish public adored Ferdinand, viewing him as their potential savior. This family drama reached its boiling point in March 1808, a popular uprising. The tumult of Aranjuez forced Godoy from power and compelled King Charles to abdicate in favor of his son, who became King Ferdinand VII. The crowds in Madrid were ecstatic. Napoleon, ever the opportunist, saw this chaos as his golden ticket. He refused to recognize Ferdinand as the legitimate king. Instead, he invited the entire dysfunctional Spanish royal family, Charles, Ferdinand, and the rest to a friendly meeting in the French city of Bayonne. It was a classic trap. Once they were on French soil, far from their supporters, Napoleon put the screws on them. He forced both Ferdinand and Charles to abdicate their rights to the Spanish throne and hand the crown over to him. Just like that, the Bourbon dynasty in Spain was over. Who would Napoleon put on the throne instead? His own brother, Joseph Bonaparte. Joseph was, by all accounts, a decent, reform-minded guy who was actually doing a pretty good job as king of Naples. He had no desire to be king of Spain, but big brother Napoleon insisted. In May 1808, the stage was set for a new Bonaparte dynasty to rule Spain. But Napoleon made a monumental miscalculation. He thought he was just dealing with a corrupt monarchy and a passive aristocracy. He completely underestimated the Spanish people. When news of the Bayonne abdications and the French takeover reached Madrid, the city exploded. On the 2nd of May, the famous Deuce de Mayo, the ordinary citizens of Madrid rose up against the French occupying forces under Marshal Murat, armed with knives, farming tools, and whatever they could find. They fought the professional French soldiers with incredible fury in the streets. The French response was swift and brutal. The Mameluke cavalry, Napoleon's elite Egyptian horsemen, charged into the crowds, cutting them down. The uprising was crushed by the end of the day. The next day, the 3rd of May, the French began systematic executions of anyone suspected of being involved. This tragic event was immortalized by the painter Francisco Goya in his haunting masterpiece, the 3rd of May, 1808. It depicts a line of terrified Spanish civilians facing a faceless French firing squad, a powerful symbol of martyrdom and resistance. Instead of scaring the Spanish into submission, the Deuce de Mayo uprising and the subsequent executions lit a fire across the entire country. The news spread like wildfire, and province after province rose in rebellion. This wasn't a conventional war. This was a people's war. Local committees, or juntas, sprang up everywhere to organize resistance, raise armies, and govern in the name of the imprisoned Ferdinand VII, who is now seen as a national hero. The French army, accustomed to fighting and defeating conventional European armies on open battlefields, was completely unprepared for this. They found themselves facing not just poorly organized Spanish regular troops, but also swarms of guerrillas. These were ordinary people priests, peasants, bandits, and artisans who would ambush French patrols, cut supply lines, and then melt back into the civilian population. The word guerrilla, meaning little war, entered the English language from this conflict. For the French soldiers, it was a nightmare. They were surrounded by a hostile population where every civilian could be an enemy. The war took on a level of savagery rarely seen in Europe, with atrocities committed by both sides. Initially, Napoleon and his marshals were confident. They dispatched columns of troops to crush the rebellions in key cities like Zaragoza and Valencia. But they were in for a shock. In July 1808, a French army corps of around 20,000 men under General Dupont was surrounded by a Spanish army led by General Costacos at Balun, in southern Spain. Cut off from supplies and exhausted by the summer heat, Dupont was forced to surrender his entire force. The news of the Battle of Balun sent shockwaves across Europe. It was the first time in a decade that a Napoleonic field army had been defeated and forced to surrender. It was a massive blow to the myth of French invincibility. It proved that Napoleon's legions were not gods. They could be beaten. King Joseph Bonaparte, who had only just arrived in his new capital of Madrid, had to pack his bags and flee north. The French were forced to abandon most of Spain and retreat behind the Ebro River. The victory at Balun was a huge morale boost for the Spanish and their allies. Britain, seeing a golden opportunity to open a new front against Napoleon, landed an expeditionary force in Portugal under the command of a certain Sir Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. Wellesley quickly defeated the French forces in Portugal, forcing them to evacuate the country. By the autumn of 1808, Napoleon's grand plan for Iberia was in ruins. His brother had been chased out of his own capital. A French army had surrendered, and the British had a foothold on the peninsula. Napoleon was furious. He realized this wasn't some minor peasant revolt he could ignore. He decided he had to deal with it personally. He assembled the Grande Army, his main force of veteran troops, and in November 1808, he personally led over 200,000 men across the Pyrenees, back into Spain. This was Napoleon at his best. In a lightning campaign lasting just a few weeks, he smashed through the Spanish lines, won a series of decisive battles, and by early December, he had recaptured Madrid and placed his brother Joseph back on the throne. It seemed like order had been restored, but it was an illusion. While Napoleon could defeat the Spanish armies in open battle, he couldn't conquer the Spanish people. The guerrilla war intensified, and the British army, under Sir John Moore, though forced into a desperate winter retreat to the coast, had successfully drawn Napoleon's main force away, buying precious time for the resistance to regroup. Napoleon himself wouldn't stay long. News of Austria preparing for war back in Central Europe forced him to leave Spain in early 1809, leaving the Spanish ulcer in the hands of his marshals. He never returned. He thought he had stabilized the situation, but he had only just scratched the surface. The war he had started in 1808 would rage on for another 5 long, bloody years, draining France of hundreds of thousands of men and vast resources. It would become a training ground for the British Army, forge the legend of Wellington, and ultimately play a huge role in Napoleon's downfall. The invasion of Spain was a story of arrogance, betrayal, and incredible popular resistance. What started as a simple plan to close a gap in a trade embargo spiraled into a conflict that would change the course of European history. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Peninsular War, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more history content.